This week, I've got a very special guest, Professor Hakim Adi. We will be exploring fascinating stories, hidden gems, and the untold narratives that have shaped his world and our world. So, a quick intro. Hakim is instrumental in the founding of the History Matters, also the founder and consultant historian of the Young Historians Project. Has written widely on history of Africa and the African diaspora. His publications have been translated into French, Spanish, and Portuguese. One of the things we'll try to explore is his latest publication, Africa and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. It's just been published, and there's a big news about this book. The book is shortlisted for the prestigious Wolfson History Prize in September 2023. So without further ado, let's get started. Start with like some kind of obligatory question, like where were you born and raised? Okay.
I was born in Paddington in West London. Somebody asked me this question on Friday. I gave that answer. They said to me something like, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "I thought you were born in East Africa." Well, I don't think I was born in East Africa. I said, you may know more than me. Maybe I was born in East Africa, but nobody told me. I don't know where you got that idea from, but I said, no, I was born in London. As far as I'm aware, as what I've been led to believe, I grew up in a small seaside town called Whitstable, which is in Kent, near Canterbury. And I grew up there. I went to school there till I was about 18. It's a very small, quiet place. I'm very close to it now. But yeah, it's a small place. And in some ways it was quite a difficult place to grow up in. But that's the place that, yeah, kind of shaped me in that sense. In the sense of having to find ways of dealing with, an environment at school, or at all the schools I went to, where I was the only, or one of very, very few children. In those days, people didn't talk about black, or everybody. The word people used was colored. So I was, so I was the only child of color or colored child in the school, or in the schools, or one of a handful of people. So so that was quite difficult circumstance as a young child, but you get you get used to it, adjust to it, deal with it as best you can. And in a way, that's what kind of led me to be concerned with history. Although I always loved history, even at a very, very young age. Like 4 or 5, I was interested in history. But when I became a teenager, I became more interested in African history, really. History of Africa, or what today we'd call Black history. I became much more interested in that. Mainly because of the environment I was in, and trying to understand something about the society in which I lived, and the racism of that society. I think when you're a child, racism is like a kind of inexplicable phenomenon. It's you have to try and make sense of it. When you go to school at the age of 5 or whatever it is, and people are rude to you, or call you names, or make jokes, or whatever, all these things that you deal with as a child. So when I was a young teenager, probably about 13, 14, I became even more aware of these issues, just because that's the kind of age where you're, dealing with your own identity and, trying to understand the world more and so on. So I became aware that, the environment I grew up in, this is the 1960s, so it's a long time ago. Yeah, 1960s, early 1970s. So yeah, I essentially began to search for answers. That's the short way of putting it. And the way I did that was to read things. And so I'd try and find any books which told me something about Africa or told me something about, Black people generally. And obviously at that time, this is, decades before the internet appeared.
Yeah.
So in those days, you had to, or I had to, read books and literally try and find the books. So fortunately, I lived in a town that had bookshops. Or I went to school in a town, because I went to school in Canterbury. And at that time, Canterbury had, as far as I can remember, 2 bookshops. It may have had more, but I remember these 2 bookshops very close to each other at that time. And I used to go there. I'd look for various books and, read them, and then look, in the bibliography or in the footnotes or whatever. What books did they reference? And I try and get some of those. And, of course, a lot of things I didn't understand. I started reading about African history in particular. Whatever I could find, African American history, things about music, jazz. I read literature, a lot of African literature, anything I could get hold of. Obviously, at that age, it's not a very considered book list. I remember even being, when I was at school, I would have been about 15 or something like that. It's the last time I can remember winning a prize, before the Wolfson. Last prize I won, or the last prize I got close to, was when I was about 15 at school, and I won some prize. So they asked you what you could get, any books you wanted. So the 2 books I got were, or 2 or 3 books, 2 books I think, were both on African history. So anyway, I used to read all that kind of stuff. So all of that, kind of came out of my early life. And then I decided that probably around that age, around 14 or 15, I decided that I wanted to be a school teacher, a history teacher, with the aim of, being able to teach others the history that I had been not had access to. In those days, in the early 70s, there were some people who were beginning to talk about introducing the history of Africa, history of the Caribbean, and so on into schools, at GCSE level, as it would have been then. So this somehow I don't know how I knew this, but I knew that there was these kind of schemes were around. So I thought, okay, if I go and study African history, then I'll be in a good position to become a history teacher in a school, and I can, I can teach all this kind of stuff and so on. So that was basically my aim as a teenager.
I mean, I want to interject a bit. I mean, the way I see, our parents, their role. I mean, looking back, I mean, did you have any memories about those things? How they shaped your understanding about the political consciousness?
Not really. Quite the opposite. I grew up in a difficult situation. No, not difficult. Well, maybe difficult in the sense that I grew up with in a one-parent home. My father wasn't around much, and in fact wasn't around at all between the ages of 8 and 18. He wasn't around. I mean, I didn't have a father. I mean, I had a father, but he wasn't there. So I didn't have, and I guess he was the person, or he would have been the person to, to talk about, political things or whatever, intellectual things. Whereas my mother was just working to try and keep the family going. So, yeah, most of the time these were things I did on my own. I didn't discuss them with anybody. I didn't have anyone to discuss them with, really. Occasionally when I got a bit older, maybe the one or two people at school I discussed them with, but mainly the kind of, I didn't get much from my family from that point of view. So it was mainly my own investigation, my own inquiry. Obviously I got a sense of, kind of right and wrong and these kind of basic things, but nothing political. No, nothing political.
Any particular political event?
No, I don't think so. I think I was aware of obviously various things happening in the US. I was kind of vaguely aware of things going on here, Enoch Powell and so-called Rivers of Blood speech, but not very aware. When I think back on it, I had, I probably saw things on the news or they were discussed. I didn't really get interested in politics. I was interested in politics in the sense of I read people like, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, Black Power. I read Frantz Fanon. But I didn't understand much of it. I mean, I read it as a 14, 15-year-old, 16-year-old. I didn't really understand it much. And so in those years, it was more a question of identifying with that this was something positive. As I said, I was reading literature or reading history or reading Fanon or reading certainly it was like it gave me sort of positive energy, or you could say. But I didn't really understand the politics of it, I don't think, until I got to university. And then it was because there were all sorts of discussions at university with other students and my friends, and then you start to hear all the different arguments and issues, and I think my main concern at that time was racism. What is this racism all about? How do you deal with it? And so the main way you deal with it is kind of making yourself feel good, because if people are abusing you every day, the thing that you want is something positive, something which can act as a kind of an antidote. So people are saying negative things, or people are saying, Africa has no history, or whatever was being said, or, so or as a young person, I was looking for, okay, I know this happened, I know that happened, I know I know Africans did this, I know whatever, I know, and that gives me, doesn't matter what people say, I know that's not true. That's the kind of way it was. And the kind of music I listened to, all of those things were part of that same, whatever one wants to call it, that same need for like a positive identity and so on, that kind of thing. But when I got to university, then you hear all kinds of ideas, and in the sense of trying to understand racism, then you hear all the kind of ideas. Well, the problem is that, you know, some people say, well, the problem is all these white people. That's the problem. And then, okay, right, okay. And then other people will say, well, hang on a minute, you know, racism is, you know, it's like a kind of historical phenomenon that arose at a particular time within a kind of, in a particular political system. So, oh, that's very interesting. You know, okay, well, okay. And, you know, then somebody else will say, yeah, and like political systems, you know, come and go, you know, they're not immutable, they change. Oh, really? You know, then somebody else will say, yeah, there's some countries that don't have any racism. Really? Like where? You know, the people at that time would have said China or whatever people said. So then you start to realize that, or I started to realize that, well, there's a bit more to it than just whatever you're actually experiencing, that there's more that you need to understand, or I needed to understand. And so I start to, you know, try and understand, oh, there's China, what's all that about? And Chairman Mao, and what's all that about? All these kinds of different things, because those were the kind of discussions that were being held at university, and all kind of big debates and all sorts of things going on, and people discussing all sorts of things I'd never even heard of, you know, before, you know, the Soviet Union and China and Albania and what was going on in Ethiopia at the time. So you get exposed to so much, and then to try and make sense of all that. And so, you know, in the course of that, as I say, you begin to, or I began to examine other ways of looking at the world, because you realize that, okay, well, there are other ways of looking at the world, there are different ways of analyzing things, and yeah, so then you realize that, then you realize also the interconnections between things, that, okay, well, there's racism, but then there's also whatever, you know, inequality in society. There's also the oppression of women. There's also inequalities between countries. There are economic systems, there are political systems, there's, you know, the imperialist system of states or whatever. There are all these things that you have to understand if you're going to not just have an understanding of things, but actually there's a possibility of changing things. Then once you begin to think actually things can be changed, I mean, that's that's a big revelatory moment, because there are a lot of people who in the world who, you know, are really angry about things or concerned about things, but they don't have the conception that you can change anything. It's just like you keep fighting and you keep battling. And so anyway, so I as a consequence of going through university and meeting people as a result, I began to see the world in a different way, and to broaden my interests and my concerns and my understanding of the way the world operates.
I mean, like, a couple of things came out from this, like, very philosophical understanding about your life. Is it's not only like feeling positive, but also it kind of sounded like almost like you were trying to liberate yourself as well. I don't know from where. And then, you know, to change. So like feeling good, liberation, and then the change.
Well, as I said, if you think that this is the way the world is, and it's kind of unchangeable, if you have no conception of social change, political change, then your first instinct is to, or maybe your first instinct is to try to make yourself feel stronger within that situation. So that's basically, and a lot of people go through that. So you, obviously, if you're in a city where there's lots of other people who are going through the same thing as you are, you gravitate towards them, and you say, okay, let's be together and you socialize together and you do whatever you do together. But if you grow up in a place where that doesn't exist, then you have to do whatever you can do. And for me, it was just, like I say, arming myself. You can say intellectually, although my grasp of the things wasn't very profound, but at least I knew there was a different way of thinking about things. I knew there was a history which I wasn't being taught at school. There was another history. There was a history of Africa. There was a history of Black people. There was, there were people who were, great athletes, footballers. I mean, this is 60s. There weren't even that many Black footballers around. It would only be when there was a World Cup, maybe, and you'd see, the Brazilian team, or you'd see, Eusebio, or you'd see whoever was around at that time. It's not like it was not like it is now. So you take strength from that. You take strength from the fact that greatest, for example, I took great strength from Muhammad Ali, the boxer, because here was a Black guy saying, I'm the greatest. And he was. Yeah. So you take great, as a young person growing up, I didn't necessarily understand everything that he was saying, but I knew he was standing up for me. He didn't know me, but he was standing up. He was making a stand for himself and for me and for others and so on. And he was that was a very positive role model in the sense, not really a role model, but just somebody you could look up to and say, yeah, this is a Black person who's great, who's beaten everybody, who's stood up, who's refused to compromise his views, has come back, has won again, has become, all these kinds of things. So people like that, and I mean others, were, very inspiring. And as I said, that is, even today, many people will naturally gravitate towards that. You kind of surround yourself with positivity because it helps you deal with the negativity that you deal with every day. And when I got a bit older, I could do the things that people, for example, in London do. You go to a dance, for example, and everybody, it's a dance full of Black people. You're listening to music which is uplifting. Everybody's enjoying themselves. You come out, you feel good. I mean, it's as simple as that. And that is a very important thing. People have even spoken about that at this time, that the fact you go to a party or you go to a club, you're with people like you who are experiencing the same things as you. You listen to music which is talking about these things in some way, or, uplifting in some way. That's great. But the point I'm making is that that's just like the first level of things. You're feeling good. You feel strengthened by whatever the experience is, whether it's listening to music, reading a book, going to a club, socializing with others. That's great. But okay, that doesn't actually change anything. Then you get to the kind of next level where you begin to understand, or think you have some understanding of why these things happen, who's responsible for them, what can you do about it. And that's another important stage in life, because once you have some understanding of why things go on in society, or even that there is such a thing as society, that in itself is important. There's a society. It has these kind of features. There's a state. The state represents certain interests. All these kinds of things. You begin to see the world differently. And I mean, at that time, the kind of mid-70s, mid-70s, was the time of the National Front and the other kind of fascist organizations who were, at that time being promoted by the state. So what did that mean? That meant that one fascist would walk down the road and 10,000 police would come and protect them. That's what it meant. And you could you could see it. Why would they do that? Anyway. So that experience of one racist walking down the street, or 10 or 100, and thousands of police coming to protect them, that for me was like very helpful in understanding that there's a thing called the state, and that the state represents certain interests. Because you would say that in any sort of decent society, the state would arrest the racists and put them in prison. but the state did the opposite. It came and looked after them. And if you went and protested and said, well, hang on a minute, the racists shouldn't have any right to organize in a civilized society, the police will arrest you. So that was very helpful. I'm not saying I wish anybody to go through it, but it was helpful, because you think, yeah, that is right. There is this state, and it does operate in that way, and it does do these things and so on. So, and of course, if one looks at the kind of role of the police generally in terms of my experience, or our collective experience over the last 40 years, and now everybody says what we were saying in the 1970s, that even the police say it. The police say, well, of course we're institutionally racist. But in the 1970s, the people who were saying that were black people and political people. It wasn't a generally held view. Now everybody says, metropolitan police, of course, are racist. Of course, they're anti-women. Of course, they're corrupt. Of course, they're, one can't have any trust in them. Everybody says it, So my point I'm making is, through experience, I began to, understand things in a different way. And then, what you want to, try and do something to change things, and to realize that a struggle is going on, that lots of people want to change things. And so, how can you contribute to that? What role can you play? Those also become important questions. So it's not just like a personal problem, or even just a collective problem, but actually something that you can try and do something about, whatever that might be. And that might be through protesting on the streets against the fascists, or it might be educating people, or it might be, I don't know, all sorts of other possibilities, organizing in a trade union, or whatever.
I mean, it's like a multifaceted role we have to play. And it looks like you were not only a student, but also an activist on the street, trade union, this, that, all kind of things happening around you. So quite a life to live. But also part of is also, you are educating yourself, you are liberating yourself, you are empowering yourself. And then this like idea about doing PhD. So it looks like from like dream about becoming a school teacher, now you decided to do a PhD. So that means your dream got bigger.
Well, yes and no. I mean, in fact, at that sort of time, I think when I was about 18, I had wild dreams when I was 18, I remember. I was going to be a school teacher, but my dreams were something else. My dreams weren't about being a teacher as such. My dreams were about being, being a basketball player, or being a, jazz pianist, or being a professor of African history. Those were my dreams. But of course, I never thought that they were just dreams, that you have. But yeah, I wanted to be a school teacher. But then while I was at university, I got kind of, I'm not sure what the word is. I got sort of spotted by some professor. And he said to me, oh, would you like to do some research or something? And I said, yeah, sure. I didn't really think too much about it. But on the basis of me saying, yeah, if you like, he went and applied for a research fellowship or research scholarship for me. And then came back and said, oh, where you are, come and do it. So I'm like, oh, really? Oh, okay. So I began to do a PhD. Yeah, in a kind of bit unexpectedly. It wasn't like I wanted to do a PhD. It was more like, here you are, if you want to do a PhD, come and do it. So I did something, I started something, maybe it came at the wrong time. I was doing all kind of political things on the streets, and maybe it came at the wrong time, and various things went wrong with it, which made me very suspicious of academia. I felt that I wasn't able to write it in the way that I wanted to write it, or to approach it in the way I wanted to approach it. So I started it. I did it for about 2 years. And then I said, this is a waste of time. It's not going the way I want it to go. I can't do the kind of field work. And it was also in social anthropology, because I did a joint degree in African history and social anthropology. It was in social anthropology, which I had my doubts about anyway. What is this subject? So I decided, look, this is a sort of a digression from what I really want to do. What I really want to do is be a school teacher and teach history. So let me just leave. Let me just give it all up. And I think also my research wasn't upgraded from MPhil to PhD for various reasons. I said, no, it's just a waste of time. Let me go and be a teacher. So I left this PhD and applied to teacher training college. Applied to 2 colleges. I remember applying to 2 specific colleges in London. And lo and behold, they both rejected me.
Wow.
So, for whatever reason, I don't know why they rejected me, but they both rejected me. And so I had nothing to do. I mean, I left university. I had no PhD. I had no job to go to. I had no training. I had nothing. And so I guess I was very active in politics for a while. I was unemployed for, I don't know, about 2 years. And then I saw some part-time work as a youth worker. So I thought, oh yeah, let me do some of that. Just, So I got a job as a youth worker, and then the opportunity came to be a full-time youth and community worker. So I got this job in London. And in those days, the local authority that I worked for whatever reason, I can't remember the exact reason, they wanted all their full-time youth workers, as I was, to be professionally qualified. And in those days, you could, if you had a teaching qualification, it also qualified you as a youth and community worker. So they said, So they told us this. So I reapplied to one of the colleges that had rejected me 4 years before, or whatever long it was. When I told my employers that I had applied to this college, they said, well, why are you applying there? Like, who are they? We don't recognize them. We don't recognize their qualification. I said, oh, really? So anyway, by a strange coincidence, this same college invited me to an interview. And my colleague, who was in the same position, they invited her at the same time. We had interviews exactly at the same time. So I'm sitting in my interview. It's just started. She's in her interview. Suddenly, the person who's interviewing her bursts into my interview. And he said, what's this I hear? Your employers don't recognize this college and its qualification. I said, well, that's true. They told us they don't. They said, this is disgraceful. This is an outrage. We're going to give you both a place immediately without any interview. So by pure whatever luck, circumstance, the teacher training college that had rejected me 4 years before was now offering me a place without even interviewing. So anyway, so through that process, I became a teacher, and then the qualification was to essentially to teach in FE college. In fact, my first job teaching in FE college was to teach careers education. Well, for someone who'd been unemployed, what did I know about careers education? Anyway, I was teaching this, and gradually I taught a little bit of history, of GCSE history, and later a bit of A-level history and so on. And I also tried to do a little bit of African history, maybe community level or adult education or whatever. But it soon became clear that I wouldn't really be able to teach that at FE level. And everybody said to me, look, you need to go and do a PhD. The only way you're going to be able to teach it is to teach at a university. So, okay. So I said, okay, let me go and start again. So I went back to my university and I applied to do, I thought, I've just walked out of a PhD. They'll probably be a bit angry with me. And let me just apply to do a master's program. So I applied to do this master's program. Basically, they wrote back to me and said, look, why have you applied to do a master's? Just come and do a PhD. This time it was in history, in African history. They said, come and do a PhD. So I began a second PhD. I did it part-time for 7 years while I was teaching in FE college because I had to fund it. And I used to find it very expensive, as a part-time teacher. But I did that for 7 years. And then 7 years later, I got the PhD, and about a year after I got the PhD, I managed to get a post at Middlesex University. And I taught there part-time first, and I got a post. And I think I was one of the first people in the country, actually, to get a post in Black British history, so-called. That was 1995. And that's when my, academic career began.
I can relate lots of things, what you gone through. Like our life is full of chances, isn't it? Our life is not like destiny. You just go there and then, our life is, the amount of time we got killed is like, the amount of time we just like gone.
I used to, for many, many years, I used to think to myself, look, you've wasted, let me see, if I'd continued with my first PhD, I would have finished it in 1982. I finished my second PhD in 1995. So that is 13 years, or 12, 13 years. So I used to think all the time about myself, look, you've wasted 12 years. You're 12 years behind schedule. What a kind of waste of time. And it was only years later when I became professor and I realized I was the first person of African heritage to become history professor. I thought, well, how is that possible? I'm like 12 years behind schedule or whatever. How is it I'm the first? It didn't make any sense. But yeah, life is strange, and I think what it sort of demonstrates to me is you just keep going. You want to do something. Don't give up. Just keep going. You don't know how it will happen or when it will happen or why exactly, but if you keep going, you'll probably get there. Whereas if you give up, you won't. So like any journey, life is a journey. You just keep going and keep doing what you're doing and what you think is important. And yeah, just keep going.
So like the things you did in your PhD, do you think that was the kind of ground zero? Like that's the groundwork, what you have been doing all through your
yeah, exactly. I sort of after, you know, thinking about it a little bit, I chose to do something on West Africans in Britain, West African students really in Britain. And part of the thinking was to do something which connected Britain and Africa, West Africa in particular. And this, you know, I didn't necessarily know that much about it when I started. But yes, it really is what has given rise to everything that I've done. And it's probably not pure chance, but it's, you know, it's, as I say, I didn't necessarily know it that much about it when I started, but, you know, it's led me to focus a lot of my work on African and Caribbean people in Britain. That's what I was doing. It's led me to look a lot at anti-colonialism. That's what it's about. It's led me to look a lot at Pan-Africanism, to write about Pan-Africanism. Yeah, so all the work that I've done subsequently has really come out of that PhD. That was the basis for everything. And in fact, I'm hoping that the next book I write will, in a way, go back again to that, some of the work that I did for that PhD, and sort of try and join up some of the dots. But yeah, that's definitely the basis of everything that I've done. The only thing, and if you look at the subtitle of the book that came out of that thesis, West Africans in Britain, 1900, 1960, Nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Communism. I mean, that's everything I've written has really been in those, summed up in those three words. So, yeah.
I was like trying to buy your book through Amazon, and then I was interested in like what the, you know, like in like Amazon, all kind of people write reviews, and I can see like
the racists write reviews, definitely.
Like at least 10 people took time to write a review on your book, you know.
Well, yeah, you have to be very circumspect about those reviews, because I know certainly with the recent book, the racists who attack me, you know, organize people to write negative reviews. So you will, I don't know whether they're still there. They might have been taken down, but certainly the most recent book, they write negative reviews. Sometimes they write negative reviews and then they write and tell me. And they say, have you seen all the negative reviews about your book? You know, there's this, well, there have been two separate people who make videos on YouTube about my books. And so they're all lies, and they even write about the books I've written for children, and so I'm corrupting young people and all kind of nonsense. They spend quite a lot of time attacking me, which is quite good. I mean, it's one realizes, you know, that you're really doing something useful if people are complete racists spend time attacking you. So,
but I mean, you have been working on this field for a long time. You know? It never stops, like this kind of resistance from the, you know, the structure, from the state, from the society.
No, we live in a society which is we live in a society that has its racism. It has its anti-racism too, but certainly the powers that be, the powers that be have a very definite view on what kind of history should be promoted, what kind of history should be established, and to some extent the universities, you know, to some degree, obviously there's a struggle going on, but to some degree the major institutions take their cue from the powers that be. I mean, at the moment, you know, various government ministers, prime minister, talk about, what kind of degrees are important, what kind of degrees aren't important. In the past, leading politicians have given their views on history. The former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for example, said that, the problem with, the problem with Africa is not that we were there, but that we're not there any longer, was his comment. I remember the Labour Prime Minister, not Labour, he was Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said that, Britain should stop apologising for colonial rule. Well, I mean, when did it start to apologise? It must live in a different world. So they all make comments about history, particularly about colonialism, but also about other things. I mean, Michael Gove, when he was education minister, encouraged the development of a whole history curriculum, a whole national curriculum in history, for history, which was just basically about the white men of property, and everybody else was excluded from it. Women were excluded, working people excluded, Africans, Asians, everybody was excluded. And so they regularly do this. You think back to the centenary of the First World War, for example. Wasn't that long ago, they went overtime on, it was all about the beastly Germans, and it was all about saving poor little Belgium. It was all about defending Western civilization. I mean, it's complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. So anyway, there's all of that. And then after 2020, there's a kind of backlash to what we can call the Black Lives Matter movement. So the Black Lives Matter movement was basically an anti-racist movement, a national movement, a very important national movement. People saying we're fed up with racism, we should put an end to it, and so on. And the sort of, I guess, the symbolic act of that was the toppling of the statue of some criminal in Bristol. So in the wake of that, there's been the powers that be that have reacted and said, look, start talking about people rewriting history, and these people always attacking our history, and all this kind of nonsense goes on. And so that has its impact, definitely. And it's obviously completely in opposition to the kind of history that I write. And I mean, what the powers that be are doing is attempted to perpetuate all the myths of the past, which is that, the myths that the Britain has always been, the kind of island home of, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or whatever they think it is. All this kind of rubbish about history. All that colonialism was a good thing. All these kind of.
Like the first black person came here in 1948.
Yeah, I mean, that I didn't even want to mention that one. That one's just so terrible. Yeah, it's all about his ship arriving in 1948, and all these myths that they perpetuate. Africa has no history is another myth. Things that are very, very damaging, to everybody, and to young people in particular. And I mean, a lot of those myths obviously existed well before 2020, but the powers that be have then, gone even further to try and entrench them. And to anybody who says anything different, they're accused of rewriting history and all this kind of thing. So, what I do is to just try and present things as they are, present the evidence, definitely try to explain in such a way that they can be helpful to people, whether that's Africans or working people or whoever it is. Just tell the truth about things. And so, yeah, one is in that situation where, for example, being made redundant twice is not accidental. It's not because I'm, a terrible person, or I'm, I don't do any work, or I don't write, material which is, academically rigorous or whatever. It's not about that. It's about the climate in which higher education exists in this country, the fact that it's increasingly run as a business for business, rather than for the enlightenment of people generally, and for producing the kind of citizens we need in the 21st century, and so on. That it's underfunded, etc., etc., etc. So, that is the context in which, redundancies occur, and in which universities make decisions where they don't take into consideration at all the needs of the society, the needs of people, the need to repair the damage that's been caused in the past. These things are not important that they consider. So one has to understand that and fight against it, and say, no, we're not prepared to accept that. But we have, you have to recognize that it's a fight, and you can be very eminent, you can be, shortlisted for some prize or whatever. But if the history that you're concerned with is a particular type of history, then it's always going to be under threat, you could say. So realizing that and trying to develop mechanisms to deal with that, I think, is par for the course, and that's the work I've always tried to do. So I work within the academy, but I also work outside the academy and try to work particularly with young people, or with anybody who's interested in developing a history which is inclusive, in the sense that it includes everybody. In my particular case, I'm particularly concerned with including those of African heritage, or we could say African and Caribbean heritage, that our lives, our struggles, our contributions, our presence exists. And because it exists, it needs to be acknowledged and recognized and recorded and, understood. And what one has to go on doing that work, whether somebody says we're going to employ you to do it, or they say, well, we're not going to employ you to do it, you just have to keep doing it. That's just the way things are. So
I mean,
it in a way, it comes back to where I started, that saying that all of these things are to do with, the kind of society that we live in. You can't just see it as, it's a personal misfortune, or it's, you have to be able to analyze, understand what's going on, and therefore keep fighting to change things, to transform things, so that these problems don't occur in the future.
And especially you talked about, this like idea about African people have got no history. I mean, and like when a whole country, a whole society internalize those things, I mean, it looks like, the way, you become, or you became redundant. It seems easy because these people have got no history. They're like already, dehumanized through the society. So you're a historian, like in terms of like falsifying history, it's quite dangerous as well, because this can harm large number of people.
Well, it harms everybody.
Yeah.
It harms everybody because, as I always say, history isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. And so if you grow up in a society which doesn't recognize certain types of people, that has implications for how you think about the world, how you see yourself in the world, and so on. And It was pure coincidence and irony that this year the UN talked about the importance of transformative education to deal with the problems of the past, and particularly racism, that you need essentially anti-racist education, or education which is opposed to this kind of falsification of history and so on. And that was precisely, in those circumstances that I was made redundant and the course closed down and so on. But we need people to be educated about the world in which they live, to understand the world in which they live, to understand everybody has contributed to it, in terms of, scientific advance and development and so on, to understand that the prosperity of some countries is dependent on the impoverishment of others, the exploitation of others. These are just the facts of human history, and people need to recognize them, that there's a need for reparatory justice to repair the damage of the past and of the present. And I always remember, and that's important for everybody. We can say, yes, if you don't have a history of Africa or a history of Africans, that's bad for Africans. But it's also bad for everybody else in the country, because they then have this distorted view of, or not a full view of the world. And it's precisely having that full view and understanding the significance of all human beings, which is so important, because it shows us that all human beings can and have contributed to change. And the study of history is really the study of change and how it comes about, and the role that human beings play in it, and the role that we play. And if we understand that as workers, as Africans, as women, as human beings, that we are the agents of change, we are the makers of history, that's incredibly empowering. Whereas if we're written out of history and we think we're inconsequential, then that's also very, very significant. And I always remember when I first started at the University of Chichester, I taught a course, a first-year module on the history of Africa and the African diaspora in the modern period, so from maybe like 1500 onwards. So this is a big survey course in 10 weeks. So where we did a little bit about Africa, we did something on the Caribbean, we did something on the US, we did something on Britain, all in 10 weeks. And in my first semester at the university, the students voted that module of the year. And when you spoke to them and asked them, why is this? Why do you like this module? And they all said, well, this is fantastic. We've never learnt these things before in school. Isn't this interesting? Isn't this fascinating? We learnt so many things that we didn't quite understand. Now we understand this and this. And these are 99% white students. So this is so important. And I usually give an example of years ago, whatever it was, nearly 20 years ago, no, 16 years ago, something like that. I met this young English woman, teacher, history teacher. And we were talking in those years about the question of abolition and slavery and all these kind of things, because it was the bicentennial of the parliamentary abolition, 2007, so 16 years ago. And we were talking, and she said to me, teaching this history is very difficult. So I said, is it really? Well, why is it difficult? She said, one feels so guilty about all these things. I said, oh, really? Why? What do you feel guilty about? She said, well, my ancestors, are enslaving people and this and that. I said, really? Were they? I said, look, if you look back at Britain's history in the 18th century, it's more likely that your ancestors were signing petitions against human trafficking, refusing to take sugar in their tea and coffee. They were probably part of this mass movement of the 1780s, 1790s, and so on. Why would you think otherwise? So here's a person who teaches history who doesn't know about one of the biggest movements in Britain's history, and most people don't because nobody ever talks about it. But this is the importance of understanding history, because we understand then that, working people, women, Africans, they were all united in this movement, and they understood, as some of them said at the time, that if you're for the rights of one section of the people, then you must be for the rights of all. You're for the rights of black people, you're for the rights of white people. They understood that in the 18th century. But some of us don't understand it in the 21st century. When we study history, then we begin to understand these things. And isn't that a powerful thing to understand? And isn't it, it's no wonder that the powers that be don't want people to understand, don't want people to even know about some of these things. And of course, there's negative things, but then let's point the finger at those who are responsible. I have to give a talk, I think next week, about the monarchy and slavery. What could be easier? What could be easier?
Yeah.
Because every single monarch, from Elizabeth Tudor up to William IV, were the leading slavers, the leading human traffickers. They even had their own raw monopolies, the Raw Africa Company. They were called Royal because that was their business. The king, the king's brother, the king's family, all of them. Queen Anne, saying how triumphant she was. Look, Britain, we've got the asiento. We've got the license to supply Africans to the Spanish colonies. That was their business for 300, whatever it was, years. William IV stood up in the House of Lords. What do you mean abolition? We're not going to abolish anything. That was what they were about. So if we want to look at, and that's not saying bad things about Britain. That's saying bad things about the monarchy, sure, because that's what they did. But it doesn't mean that the people of Britain were doing those things. It means that's what the monarchy was about. So let's understand the history. Let's, if we want to make criticisms of people, or let's be clear who we're criticizing, who the criminals were. Let's understand these things, because understanding that maybe helps us understand things today, understand our place in history, understand our role in the world. And, that's very, very important for everybody. So, that's what I try and do, what I try to present, if I can.
I mean, that's so powerful. The story you told me about this particular history teacher. So I teach Middle East politics. Like whenever I speak about, Iraq invasion and all those things, I can see my students, those are like 99% are from here. And you can see almost like they feel guilty about that. And I try to tell them that, when I was in those protest march, anti-war protest march in Glasgow, the millions of people, thousands of people,
It's literally millions.
This could be your parents, your uncles.
They probably were.
No,
I remember those marches very, very well, because one of the characteristics of those marches on the eve of the invasion of Iraq was the breadth, that there were people there who'd never been on a demonstration before. Never, ever. We always said, I don't come on demonstrations, but this time. So, and that's, to us, that's just yesterday. But no, that's ancient history to our students. But no, these are very important things that we're clear about these kinds of issues, and we understand these things, and we apportion blame where blame should be apportioned. We don't want anyone to feel guilty where they shouldn't feel guilty, and we just understand the world in which we live. That's all it's about, just understanding it, drawing the conclusions, the appropriate conclusions from history. And of course, if that's distorted, if you leave out women, you leave out working people, you leave out people of color, how can you understand anything? If it's just about the white men of property. Funnily enough, I went to Chartwell, Churchill's house, the other day for something. this is just anyway. I was there for something quite respectable, but anyway, it happened to be held there. And you go into the garden, and there's all these things, Duke of Marlborough fighting these things, and then you think, yeah, but if you just learn this history, Duke of Marlborough and all these troops in red coats fighting, and so on and so forth, without understanding what was this fight actually about. Why were they fighting the French? Why were they, or whoever they were fighting? I can't remember who they were fighting. But anyway, these wars of the 18th century, what was going on there? All the wars at the beginning of the 18th century, anyway, end of the 17th century. What were they? These were, there were colonial wars. There were wars over dividing the world. There were wars over who controlled India, who controlled the Caribbean, who controlled human trafficking. There's no glory in that. But the white men of property present all this as, these glorious battles, and Britain won or Britain lost or whatever. But for the rest of us, we need to understand what was actually going on. These were the wars that were fought in the interest of the rich. They developed their system accordingly. They set up the Bank of England. They set up the national debt to finance these wars and to develop. These are the kind of facts of history. And let's present them, and then we draw the appropriate conclusions from them.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing for time?
We are good, but I really want to touch the Black History Month a bit.
Okay.
Because you are a historian, you are anti-racist writer and all those things. And universities, the way universities do these things, I mean, I'm very critical about the way this kind of tokenism they do every year. And it makes me angry every year. What's your take on that? What's going on?
Well, I always say that Black History Month is a reflection of a problem. If you have a Black History Month, what it's saying is that, okay, this history, our history, is not recognized the other 11 months of the year, but we're going to at least recognize it in 1 month. Okay, fine. Well, that's been established, and for Black History Month, it has its history in the US and proceeding going back many, many years and so on. So the fact that we still commemorate it shows us that we still have that problem that we haven't solved. So that's the first thing to say. Then, of course, that presenting everything in 1 month is only important for a month. Of course, it creates its own problems because everybody crams everything into this month. People do all kinds of things that are not particularly related to history or anything else, and so on and so forth. But the major problem is that it's kind of ghettoizing things, isn't it? You present it in this month, the rest of the year you can forget about it. And that's a problem. And for me, every day, every week, every month, every year, it's the history is there, and the history is important. And we have to have a situation where this history is taught, is integrated into the existing history. It's seen as being important. It's every month of the year, and that's not the case. It's a bit like, in the post-2020 period. You had all these institutions coming out, universities making statements, we're anti-racist, we're this, including the University of Chichester. The University of Chichester made a statement, we're anti-racist. But the Vice Chancellor of the University of Chichester had suppressed a report on equality, diversity, inclusivity in the university since 2016. So how can you make a statement saying, oh, yes, we love everybody and we're for this, that, and the other? It's complete hypocrisy. So, after 2020, they all make statements. Some of them even appoint people. So, oh, yes, we're very concerned with Black history or whatever. We appoint this person there. and it's just one person, and you're not even sure what they're teaching, and this and that. It's it is essentially tokenistic. You can say, okay, you can say it's better than nothing, but it's not really addressing the problem, because that one person who's brought into a history department of 20 people or 30 people, okay, it makes some difference, but it doesn't address the general problems of that department or the general problems of the kind of history that's being taught and so on. So it's problematic. You know, we try and make something of it and utilize it and take advantage of it, but it's, you know, we have to be doing that every day, every month, and trying to change things. And it's too easy for you know, people to, and it happens to me now, people are ringing me up, can you do this in October? I'm like, you know, why is it not important? Why didn't you contact me in May and ask me? You suddenly discovered this is something important, and you want. So this is the difficulty with it. You don't want to say, well, no, we should abolish it or something, because that would probably make things even worse. But how to develop it throughout the year, and how to encourage the inclusion of the history of everybody throughout the year. That's important, and that's what's often lost sight of, unfortunately.
Like one very last question. It's a like fictional setting that you're inviting three historical figures to a dinner, to have an amazing dinner for you. I mean, who could be those three people?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think for me as a historian, because I'd want to ask them all questions about why this happened or what happened. I would say one person I would invite to dinner would be Alice Kinloch. Alice Kinloch was a South African woman who is really the inspirer, the initiator in some ways of the modern Pan-African movement. She was actually written out of history for a long time, but she came to Britain in the 1890s, and she really inspired the foundation of the African Association, which then convened the first Pan-African conference in 1900. So I'd invite her and ask her, you know, what was going on, what happened to her in her later life, things that we don't know very much about. So she would be one person, I think. Then I think another important figure from Africa that I'd probably invite would be somebody like Amilcar Cabral, who led the liberation struggle in Guinea and Cape Verde. And I think just to talk to him about some of the principles of that struggle, how to involve the participation of people at the base, at the ground roots level, how to organize people in that way, and some of his ideas about popular participation and uniting people in struggle, very important. I mean, other people have taken up those ideas, but he was an important developer of that approach to liberation. And then somebody who I mentioned earlier, who inspired me as a young person, a child, like probably Muhammad Ali, who would just entertain everybody anyway. We probably will just sit listening to him. But yeah, somebody like that. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of other people I would invite, but those three maybe come to mind.
Thank you, Hakim.